Tom Cheetham, welcome.
Thank you. Hi.
So, Tom, you are the author of 4 books on the implications of Henry Corbin's work for the contemporary world. You're a fellow of the Temenos Academy in London. Is it Temenos or Temenos?
Temenos.
Temenos Academy in London, and an adjunct professor at the College of the Atlantic in Bar Harbor, Maine. And you lecture regularly in Europe and the United States. And we're up at Sonoma State University with an incredibly sophisticated audience. I must say, the quality of the questions
and their persistence
just blew me away. I mean, I taught I used to teach political philosophy at Yale in the 70s, and I got to say the students were not as good. So you've done 4 books on Henry Corbin, but let's start with a really simple question. What is the elevator speech on Henry Corbin? Who was Henry Corbin?
He was a French theologian and philosopher and mystic, one of the most important 20th century scholars of Islamic mysticism. He did lots of work, particularly in Iranian Sufism, and he was a colleague of Jung at the Eranos lectures. He was a professor of the religions of Arabia at the Sorbonne. He followed Louis Massignon. And he also taught at the University of Tehran in Iran for many years until he died in 1978. And his major contribution in one sense is scholarly, in that he oversaw the translation and publication of all sorts of medieval manuscripts, which otherwise, he was the first Westerner and the first person to show a real interest in that tradition, and to make sure that those books were translated and the scholarly work done on them.
And his most famous book is?
Probably, it's now called Alone with the Alone, published by Princeton University Press. The original title and the subtitle is Creative Imagination in the Sufism of Ibn Arabi.
Okay. And Harold Bloom wrote the introduction to that new version. And again, Harold Bloom, we were talking over lunch, a very great Yale literary critic, scholar of Shakespeare, but also amazingly prescient in terms of the breadth of his vision and what he considers important. And he considers Corbin extraordinarily important. He compares him to Grissom Scholem, the great Jewish scholar of Jewish mysticism. So he considers him extraordinarily important, and has a sense that he simply is not known at the same level, at the level he should be known.
I certainly agree with him there.
And Corbin, you came to Corbin from an interest in archetypal psychology, the psychology of James Hillman, and also eco-psychology. So you came at it both from the green point of view and the depth post-Jungian archetypal psychology point of view.
Yes, it was reading Hillman that was when I first heard of Corbin.
Right. And you were a biologist, an eco-biologist. What was your?
I was teaching environmental studies at the time. My undergraduate degree was in philosophy, and I don't think that ever. It says something about you, and I don't think it ever leaves you. So, I went on eventually to get a degree in biology. There was something about, at least the way that I was doing philosophy, that was not very helpful to me. And eventually I sort of gave up trying to get a graduate degree in philosophy, and ended up doing biology because that's what grabbed me at the time. And so I was teaching environmental studies and happened upon Hillman's work, and it was reading Hillman's work, I think, that gave me the clue about what it was wrong in my prior approach to philosophy, because we were talking about this earlier. You were very taken with archetypal psychology and Hillman, and I just ran across his books in a bookstore in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and looked interesting. It was Thomas More's collection, and I put it on my shelf for a while. And then one day I pulled it down and started leafing through it, and it was just electric. I was doing theoretical biology at the time, actually, and when I picked up Hillman's book, it hit me like a shot. This is what I've been after all along, and this was really, I think, the approach, I don't want to say psychological approach because that demeans it, but the imaginative approach to everything. And what I had been, I think, trying to do as a student of philosophy was to exercise my imaginative organs, but I was cramped and frozen in ways that I didn't understand, and so it never really worked for me.
Mm-hmm. And so let's just take a moment on, just as we did with Corbin, who is James Hillman and what is archetypal psychology in the simplest sense?
Well, Hillman was, he just passed away a year ago or so. He was a Jungian psychologist who was director of the Jung Institute in Zurich for a while, and he was a participant in the Eranos lectures for several years. Then you moved to the United States, and I mean, he's widely regarded as sort of a renegade Jungian because he is suspicious of the institutionalization of some of Jung's ideas, but he's rooted in Jung's work. And so in order to understand where Hillman's coming from, it's pretty helpful to know what Jung's orientation was.
Mm-hmm. Now, did Hillman lead you to Corbin?
Yes, it was his 1981 Eranos lecture, The Thought of the Heart. At the time I read that, I'd read quite a bit of Hillman and was extremely interested by it and very excited by it, and was really being extremely useful to me. And Hillman says in that book some things about Corbin which were so enthusiastic. Corbin obviously meant a great deal to Hillman, and I thought, if he said such interesting things about this man, I've never heard of him, and I must find out stuff, because in order to understand Hillman, I'd read quite a bit of Jung, and Hillman said, well, I mean, really, he says that Jung and Freud and Corbin are really the three foundational figures for what he developed as archetypal psychology, and I'd never heard of Corbin, so I grabbed his book, Creative Imagination and the Sufism of Ibn Arabi, and that was the end of that.
So what is the simplest way to describe the distinction between Jungian psychology and archetypal psychology?
It requires being unfair to both of them.
Yeah, but just...
Jung's psychology is based on the notion of integration of the four psychological functions that he thought were primary: thought, feeling, intuition, and sensation. And his overriding concern was the wholeness of the psyche, which he thought was a sort of teleological goal, that there was a wholeness to be had, and that each of us, if things work out, each of us has a pathway towards becoming our true self, which involves the integration of all the functions of our psyche. Hillman was somewhat skeptical of that approach to development, and in good postmodern fashion. I mean, if Jung is a modernist, then Hillman is the postmodernist. And while he agrees with Jung about the absolute centrality of imagination for every aspect of human life, he disagrees about the necessity for integration.
Right. Somebody once told me that Hillman had remarked to him that he loved Jung's psychology but not his metaphysics.
Yeah, yeah. I suppose one way to approach that is to say that, well, one way to approach that is to say that Jung never, I'm not sure it really answers your question, it speaks to your question, but Jung never gave up the idea of being a medical doctor and a scientist. And so he tended to hang on pretty tightly to notions of objectivity and health and therapy, which in fact may have conflicted with his desire to put the imagination at the center of everything. And Hillman had no qualms whatsoever about giving up a scientific grounding, that is, a literal scientific psychological grounding for his psychology. He's perfectly happy to put imagination at the center of everything and give up what he liked to refer to as the literalism of science.
Now you have a website, the Henry Corbin Project, is that?
Yeah.
Yeah. What is the URL? I think it's the Henry Corbin.
Yeah, it is. The title of it is The Legacy of Henry Corbin.
Right. And you've written 4, so Corbin really seized you, obviously.
Yeah.
I've even thought, when I was thinking about the way he seized you almost the way an archetype seizes one, no?
Yeah, yes, and yeah, that's pretty good because I've never been quite sure what about it.
Because you thought you were complete when you'd written 3 books, and then you've just written a 4th, right?
Yeah, well, it just keeps coming because yeah.
And now you think you're finished.
Well, I think I may be finished. Yeah.
But the first book started out as an essay, and it became a book, and apparently you showed it to Hillman, and Hillman was running a press and said, "Yeah, I want to publish it."
That's right. Yeah.
So that one is called The World Turned Inside Out, Henry Corbin and Islamic Mysticism. So, and my copy is heavily underlined, but as I take it, this was your effort to simply describe Corbin's work as best you could at that time.
Yeah. Right. What I'd been doing for a number of years was sort of dipping into Corbin's writings, which are complex and difficult and confusing and enormously eclectic.
Right.
And I really just found that I needed to put it all into some sort of order. So I sat down and started sketching out what looked to be some organizing themes. And I started writing, and I thought it was going to be an article that maybe someone would be interested in. But I wrote it wholly for myself, just trying to make some sense out of what I'd been reading. And that's how long it was when I was done with it. And so I sent it to Spring Publications, and Hillman read it and said it's very nice, and we will publish it.
So just to give listeners a sense, the chapter headings, Against the Times, Primordial Space, Primordial Time, and the subheads are The Active Presence and the Great Refusal. Then An Oriental Theosophy, Persia and Mazdaism, The Age of Islam, Philosophy and Theology. 3rd chapter, Modes of Knowing and Levels of Being. 4th, Coming Home, The Heart and Face of the Earth. 5th, The Angel and Individuation, subtitled The Celestial Twin and the Metaphysics of Individuation, and so on. 8 chapters like that, each going really deeply into different dimensions of Corbin's work. But let me just pick almost at random. Chapter 7, The Angelic Function of Beings. There's a section on idols and icons. What's the distinction between an idol and an icon for Corbin?
Well, for Corbin, an idol is any image that we see as fixed and opaque, that is sufficient unto itself. And this would be something that you might take as a fixed and immutable truth. And an icon can actually be anything. I suppose an idol could be anything that you take as fixed and immutable. But an icon is an idol that you see through. Mm-hmm. And you realize that there's more behind it than the literal face of it. Mm-hmm. since everything is created by God, everything has depth and mystery to it that you don't see at first.
Mm-hmm. And your second book was called Green Man, Earth Angel, The Prophetic Tradition and the Battle for the Soul of the World. So how did you go forward? What is the essence of the effort in Green Man, Earth Angel?
Well, I discovered by the time, well, I mean, in one sense, it's easy to answer. I discovered not too long after I'd written the first book that there was rather more to say, and I kept reading Corbin. One of the highlights for me in this book, the second book, is the discussion of the two lights, the two kinds of darkness that Corbin identifies as being an explanation for why Nietzsche, in particular, thought he had discovered the nihilistic root of all existence, when in fact he'd just run up against what the Sufi mystics would call a failed initiation, mm-hmm. because the black darkness of the abyss that Nietzsche thought he had found at the root of all being is really the black light at the approach to the pole, according mm-hmm. to Islamic mysticism. Mm-hmm. And that was a theme. There's a few others in here as well, but that was a theme which is just central to Corbin's thought, which I hadn't touched on at all because I didn't know about it in mm-hmm. the first book.
Doesn't a green man also refer to Qadir?
Yeah.
Okay. Who is Qadir?
Louis Massignon, there's an episode in Surah 18 of the Quran in which Moses is initiated into the mysteries of predestination. So Qadir is the figure who is the initiator of Moses himself, which is a pretty big deal because Moses is one of the major prophets. But Moses is a prophet who comes to give a law, whereas Qadir is someone who shows you what goes beyond the law, shows you the mysteries that lie beyond, in addition to, the laws. And the name, according to Louis Massignon, it means the green man or the verdant one. And the themes of greenness, which have implications for how we view the angel of the earth, are central to this book.
And the green man is distinct from the earth angel?
Yeah, though it's through contact with the green man that one learns to be able to contact, to perceive the angel of the earth.
And is the angel of the earth the same as the soul of the earth?
Yeah, for all intents and purposes.
And so earlier in the conversation today, one of the participants, a very able participant actually spoke of the soul of the earth is dying. And that was just a very striking. Was that a point of view that Corbin held?
Yeah, well, in the sense, in the sense that it's not so much the soul of the earth is dying, which may be true, but that in the first place we have become unable to see it.
To see the soul.
Yeah.
But Hillman actually is. One of the beautiful things about your work and Hillman's work is that you both take the environment seriously. You both take ecological reality seriously. That's something Carl Jung did not do, right? He took the global problematique seriously. He took, sort of the destruction. He was in the middle of World War II and so on. But he was not centrally concerned with the ecological crisis. Whereas it seems to me that both you and Hillman address.
Well, yeah, that's partly for historical reasons. It simply hadn't come to people's consciousness, Right. He certainly lived long enough so that it could have, but it wasn't central to his focus. Though in defense of Jung, his work seems to me to be perfectly consonant with ecological consciousness.
Right. Now, your third book, a remarkable book called After Prophecy, Imagination, Incarnation, and the Unity of the Prophetic Tradition, Lectures for the Temenos Academy. How did After Prophecy build on the first two books?
Well, again, the point is that there were things about Corbin's work that I kept discovering, and I hadn't, wasn't so, I mean, again, I wrote all these for myself in the first instance.
You were trying to work it out.
I was trying to work this out, and his I don't want to call it a system, but because it isn't, he's not a systematic thinker in any real sense of the word. He's too eclectic. But his vision of things is so rich and so complicated. Not only would it be difficult to summarize it in a reasonably short book, but I think it takes many years to become familiar enough with it to see where the centers are. And every time I wrote a new essay or collected them into a new book, I saw new centers. It may have been things that I'd recognized before but hadn't seen as central. And for years it was sort of a stock joke that everything in Corbin was central, which is sort of true. In this book, particularly the notion of mystical poverty was something that's crucial for his understanding of what it means to be a human person, and I hadn't brought that out, I thought.
So, say a little more about mystical poverty. It's such a key notion.
It has to do with the fact, as we were saying earlier today, that unlike Descartes' claim that I think, therefore I am, for Corbin, I am because I am thought by another. And what his approach to the human person is sort of counter to any ego psychology, which would attempt to build and strengthen the ego. It's rather a mystically tinged attempt to undo what we think of as our self, our carefully guarded and defended self, to open ourselves to the influences of what he often calls our heavenly twin, who's the other half of the human person.
Now, is our heavenly twin the angel that each of us has? Is that the sense of what the heavenly twin is?
Yeah, and it's actually, yes, that's right. In order to understand what he means by the angel as a heavenly twin, you have to realize that though he was a mystic and a monotheist, he's quite clear in saying that any experience you have of transcendence or vision of God is not, in truth, a vision of God, because God is perpetually hidden. The only visions that you can have, exalted or not, of divine transcendence will always be very partial and inherently particular and individual to you. So the paradox of monotheism is that the one God can only appear in multiple individuated and individuating manifestations. So each of us has an angel.
So each of us has an angel, and God appears to each of us in a unique way.
As that angel.
And didn't Ibn Arabi also say not only does God appear to each of us differently, but he never appears to the same person the same way twice? Yeah. So that there's this constant re-experiencing and deepening, or hopefully deepening, of one's relationship with that divine spark, which is both within us and has its twin. And so coming from there for a moment, because this goes to the key question that you've wrestled with and that your website is devoted to, which is the imaginal realm in Jung and Hillman and Corbin, which is really the heart of the whole thing, isn't it?
Yeah,
okay.
It is.
And so let's try to wrestle with that for a minute, again, being unfair to all three. But let's, going with our colleague here who wanted to really get to the simple notions, which I I agree, are so important to get to. Let's try to say how Jung understood the imaginal realm, how Corbin understood the imaginal realm, and how Hillman understood the imaginal realm. What sort of compare and contrast? What were the distinctions, if you could put it as simply as possible, among those three visions of the imaginal realm?
Well, for Jung, the imagination is completely central. Jung's a bit of a complicated case because he's pretty inconsistent. Sometimes the scientist and the Kantian in him takes over, and other times a pure imaginal psychologist takes over. So he's not always consistent, but he's at least most of the time consistent in that in claiming that we are always in psyche, and so imagination is the primary way. And imagination is the primary way in which the psyche functions, by producing images, and that all we ever really know are images. But what characterizes Jung's vision of imagination as a therapeutic technique is what he called active imagination, in which you don't just passively dream or passively have visions, but you actively engage with the persons in those dreams or visions quite consciously. And it's a process of bringing unconscious contents into consciousness by engaging in active imagination. Mm-hmm. So it's a therapeutic technique, first and foremost. Corbin shared Jung's sense that imagination was absolutely central, but his thrust is spiritual, religious, and psychological, and theological through and through. And Jung was always reluctant to say, for instance, of an image of God that, well, it proves that God exists. Because he always said, well, I'm a scientist, I'm a psychologist, I don't know what these images mean, any transcendent referent, I have to remain mute about. I'm just a humble doctor. And Corbin is a theologian and a mystic and a philosopher, and for him, the reality of the spiritual world, the reality of religious visions, simply far overrode any lingering sense one might have that these were, in any sense, merely psychological. For Jung and Corbin both, though, there's an overriding metaphysic. They're both quite different, which organizes their understanding of the imagination. For Jung, it's sort of it's the image of integration, that you should integrate your unconscious and conscious contents and your various functions of your psyche in order to become whole. Corbin's less worried about becoming whole than he is about transcending the conditions of historical life. So his motion, unlike Jung's sort of circular motion, Corbin's thrust is generally speaking vertical. And Hillman, in good postmodernist fashion, doesn't care about any of those overriding metaphysics or schemas, and he's perfectly happy to live, as he likes to put it, in a three-ring circus where there is no center, and we shouldn't worry about defending the integrity or the unity of the ego or the self in any sense, and just let everything rip.
Mm-hmm. In fact, Hillman actively opposed the imperialism of the ego. He was not interested in a form of self-improvement or any of that. Yeah, I mean, and in a sense, Jung wasn't either, because he did say famously that any but Jung
victory
was a therapist.
But he wasn't. Well, yeah, but so was Hillman.
That's true.
Their goals for therapy were rather different. I mean, and who knows why, for good practical reasons, what kinds of patients they had, what kind of people were attracted to them. But Jung clearly was working for the integration and the wholeness and the unity, and it's hard not to think of metaphors of calm and simplicity and balance. Balance would be a good metaphor to apply to what Jung was generally after, whereas sort of continual unbalance would be what Hillman
was the trickster.
After. He was absolutely the trickster, where Jung was the wise old man.
Yeah, right, yeah. So your fourth book, All the World an Icon, Henry Corbin and the Angelic Function of Beings. And really, for new readers, it almost seems to me this is the books they should read first, because it represents your mature thought about Corbin and these issues. And it's a most extraordinary piece of work. But it focuses around this concept of tawil.
Yeah.
So what is tawil?
It's a term that Corbin borrowed from Shiite Islam, which is spiritual hermeneutics. Hermeneutics simply means interpretation, but it is the baggage that comes along with that term in both Islam and in Christianity is it's hermeneutics of a text, that is interpretation, looking for the true meaning or the deep meaning or the multiple meanings of sacred scripture. Though it goes far beyond that in the Abrahamic religions, when you realize that in all these religions of the book, God speaks the world into existence. So in a sense, and Corbin is quite explicit about this, everything in creation is a text which is open to interpretation.
So as you did this work, over how many years have you been working on this?
Oh, about 20.
20. So what happened to you as you did this work? What happened to not only your map of self, but I could say the same thing for myself if I were to speak of myself, but how were you transformed by what was not simply an academic study in any sense, but really you were drawn to devote 20 years of your life to a mystic with a completely transcendental vision. And I'm really interested in what happened to your vision as you encountered Corbin.
Well, I mean, you're looking for something short and.
Well, I'll give you a little more space.
Give me a little more space, but actually, this might not be that hard. I like to think. I became more conscious. It wasn't just Corbin. I was working with Jung and with Hillman and other people helping me working through Jung and Hillman and Corbin. But I slowly became more conscious of what Jung calls the complexes. And I became, I think, less of a literalist, less apt to search for stable, fixed truths, less of a fundamentalist in some really broad sense. I like to think, I mean, in one sense, I'm not a mystic. Corbin was. I'm certainly not, and that's not necessary. All I think one might hope for is to become a little more liquid, a little more, and by that I guess I mean perceptive, and not just of the soul of the world, but more importantly of other people in your life.
So when you say you're not a mystic, which is fascinating that a non-mystic would choose to devote 20 years to one of the great mystics. In other words,
I'm a mystic wannabe.
Well, that's a big deal.
But what I mean by that is I don't think I ever had any conscious intent to have a mystic vision. But what slowly does, it seems to me, happen to you with sufficient work is the world does become a little more transparent and less difficult to get along in. This is very practical stuff. That's why I say I'm not a mystic. I suppose there's a part of most people who would sort of like to do the transcendence and get out of this crazy, chaotic mess. And that hasn't happened. That's not my intent studying Corbin. But I guess what attracted me about his putative mysticism is that it makes his vision of reality makes the world so much bigger, so much more alive, and so much more interesting than mine had ever been.
Mm-hmm. Now, you spoke of Corbin's vertical ascent, that he, if Jung took a circular path, that Corbin's view was he wanted to move upward. And help me understand if I have this right. Isn't it true that for Ibn Arabi and this Mali Sufi tradition that Corbin found so powerful, that the imaginal realm is a place where our prayers and intentions kind of go up to it, and that which we seek comes to meet us. That is, that from the angelic realm, we are met in the imaginal realm by real hierarchies of angelic
real
power.
Beings, yeah.
By real beings.
Real being, yeah.
Whereas for Jung, he remained agnostic as to whether the independent functioning of the archetypes, which he accepted, were an intrapsychic phenomenon, or in collective unconscious, a projected collective.
Yeah.
Or he didn't, as you said, he took the position that he had to be agnostic as to whether they had an independent function outside of intrapsychic functioning.
Yeah.
And that seems to me to be, we were talking about this over lunch, and you said that more and more you were just interested in practical everyday things. But to me, it remains one of the most profound epistemological questions as to whether the angelic entities, the archetypes, whatever we want to call them, do have independent existence outside of intrapsychic or collective unconscious functioning, or whether they are simply a projection from within our psyche.
See, I'm inclined to, this is going to sound too facile, but I'm inclined to think that's a category mistake, and I'm inclined to think that having those problems is a mistake of language and Wittgenstein's.
Now help me with that. Why is it a category?
In that, I'm not sure I can tease this out right now, but it seems to me it could be a vestige of Jung's Kantianism and his literalism and his scientism. Mm-hmm. He's still, in those moments when he's asking those questions and puzzling over those things, he's not taking seriously his own claim that we are always in psyche. Mm-hmm. But he's a psychologist, and so sort of by default, he's already made this cut between psyche and world. But see, Corbin occupies a theological universe where you don't have to do that, because it's all imagination. And a rock is the imagination of God, and we can't, generally speaking, make them up by imagining them, though we can make up other things like iPhones and whatnot by imagining them. But in the cosmology and metaphysics that Corbin simply assumes is true, you just don't have that problem, because it's all imagination. But it's grounded elsewhere. It's grounded in God, and so it's a sort of boundarylessness in Corbin's. Because see, Corbin doesn't have to worry about that cut between psyche and reality that is such a problem with him, because it's just not there for him.
Mm-hmm. So what did you learn from the process of writing the new book, All the World an Icon, really the Henry Corbin and the Angelic Function of Beings? What did you learn from this experience that was a step beyond the previous three books?
Well, one of the reasons that I wrote this book was because there was yet another thing that called to me, which I had not done, which was to look carefully at Corbin's early essay on cyclical time. And right now, I can't exactly remember why it was that I thought that was important. Maybe it was because I was looking into Charles Olson, who was interested in Corbin. The poet Charles Olson, yeah. He's extremely deeply affected by Corbin's work later in his life. And he saw the Cyclical Time essay as just an extraordinary piece. And I thought, I've never suffered through that. It's a very difficult, not very well-written essay by Corbin. And I thought, I really ought to do a hermeneutic. I ought to do an exegesis of that piece. And it was like pulling teeth because it's very hard to read. But I knew by then I knew Corbin well enough to sort of know what kinds of moves he would be making and to go ahead and make them in spite of him, even though he didn't do it very well himself. And so by the time I really worked carefully through that line by line, I essentially rewrote it as a couple chapters in this book, and everything just fell into place. And it was really kind of a moment of completion because this is quite an early essay by Corbin, and I thought, it's all right there. And I'd never read it because it predates some of the other big books, and I just never. I knew the piece was there, and I'd read it, but not very carefully because it is awfully dense. And I think what one discovers is that this extraordinarily complex and rich cosmology was pretty much in place in his psyche very early in his maturity as a scholar. And the other reason that it was worth doing is that I had not spoken very much about the strong Zoroastrian influences in all of Corbin's work. And this essay is front and centers Zoroastrianism and Ismailism.
So let's take both of those points, but let's start with the second one, the Zoroastrian influence on Corbin. Let's start with the obvious question for listeners. Who was Zoroaster, and how did Corbin interpret his tradition in a way that was powerful?
Well, Zoroaster was a Persian prophet from long ago. I don't remember the dates, but we're quite ancient, contemporaneous with Judaism, prior to that even, but characteristically Persian, and there are still Zoroastrians around, though not too many, and their primary symbol is a fire altar. So flame and light and illumination are primary metaphors for the Zoroastrians. And that's very important. That's a very important symbol for Corbin all through. And he saw a extremely important world historical place for Persian, particularly Persian religion and philosophy, as a sort of middle ground in a way between the cultures of the Far East and the Western religions of the book. And he classes the Avesta of the Zoroastrians as one of the prophetic books in the tradition of the peoples of the book. And his work during the Second World War, when he was in Istanbul waiting out the war, on the Persian mystic Shuravardi is central to his vision of everything, because it was Shuravardi, who was a 12th century, I think, Islamic mystic from Persia, who saw himself as trying to reconcile the Zoroastrianism of ancient Persia with the modern, relatively modern religion of Islam.
Wasn't Shuravardi called the Prophet of Light or something like that?
Yeah. Prophet of Illumination. Right. This is all
so Shuravardi and Ibn Arabi are the two central figures for Corbin.
Yeah, and Shuravardi even more so. Yeah. More than Ibn Arabi.
Right. So the depth that you've gone into in this work is extraordinary, and it's fascinating to reflect on why it is that, the Hindu tradition is such a powerful meme. The Buddhist tradition is such a powerful meme. The Judeo-Christian Abrahamic faiths are very powerful meme. And then here you have this incredible faith tradition of the Zarathustrian tradition and Persia. And somehow, as a meme in world historical religious sense, it has not fared well in comparison to the other memes. Perhaps because of the Islamic, the development of Islam, which really
I mean, I think Shiravardi didn't get a lot of traction, I guess, and his attempt to reconcile ancient Zoroastrian religion with Islam, though Corbin thought he was successful.
One of the things that fascinated me that I mentioned to you over lunch is that the Ismaili community in the world today is a fascinatingly sophisticated community headed by the Aga Khan. He has a foundation called the Aga Khan Foundation that a friend of mine worked for. And actually there's a large Ismaili community in the Bay Area. And it's a remarkably successful, globally dispersed Islamic community that perhaps because of its being persecuted for its views, developed a resilience and a sophistication so that the foundation has done extraordinarily effective work in Ismaili communities around the world. Not just for the Ismailis, but the intention of the foundation is to build those communities for everybody where Ismailis are present. And so the question I asked you was that I wondered whether the underlying sophistication which I see in Ibn Arabi, and I see it in Islam in general. I mean, to me in the West, we say, Judaism is important, Christianity is important, but in the West, there's a kind of a discounting of Islam as a lesser dispensation. But if you look at it in terms of the evolution of religious or spiritual consciousness, from Jewish monotheism to the Christ being as an emanation of love. And then somebody comes along and says, you know what? There have been prophets in all the traditions, and they all have validity. And so the light went up and it came down into all these different traditions, and we can honor them all. And of course it says, and Muhammad was the final, prophet. But nonetheless, this honoring of all the traditions in terms of the evolution of human consciousness is a major step. And then if you take Ibn Arabi as one of the foremost examples, one of the greatest of the Islamic mystics, and Corbin as championing Ibn Arabi, and the Ismailis as an expression of this, I've wondered whether their success as an actual community was a reflection of the mind map, spirit map that they held, which enabled them to negotiate in a postmodern world of great diversity.
I can't knowledgeably comment on that, but there's one thing that does occur to me, whether it has any bearing on that, I'm not sure, but Corbin would always point out about the Shiites that their position as a minority, this applies doubly to the Ismailis, position as a religious minority was actually pretty good for them because then they weren't in political control. And the problem with being politically successful is that then you have to compromise your ideals. I don't really mean that necessarily, but you've got to do political things which require you to operate in the world as if you had the truth. Mm-hmm. And for Corbin, one of the nicest things about Shiism and Ismailism is that their principles remain perpetually hidden. Mm-hmm. And that's a problem for someone who wants to act politically in the world, because politicians have to provide plans and have truths. And, but from a theological and a spiritual point of view, you don't want, Corbin would have certainly said, you don't want to literalize and make public your principles, because then they'll get institutionalized. And while institutions can be useful socially, they're very destructive in religious terms, he thought, because religious experience is always essentially individual and is never a public phenomenon. So he was arguing that if you wanted to have a vibrant and lively spiritual community, it probably shouldn't have political power.
Yeah.
I mean, he was thinking of the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages and all the problems that came with that.
And that's a very ancient dilemma, isn't it, between being active politically and not. I want to ask one more question and then open it up to the extraordinarily sophisticated audience that we have here. But you mentioned that perhaps the archetype of Henry Corbin, you didn't use that word, that's my word, may have finally relaxed its hold on you enough so that you can move on to other things. Do you have some sense of where you may be going?
Oh, Corbin keeps showing up, but in a little bit of a different way. One of the themes that's been going on for the last 20 years on and off is the writing of poetry on my own part, which I find to be a form of what Jung called active imagination. And it fits very neatly with Corbin's hermeneutics of the text. And so in some other life, my goal would not to be a philosopher or a biologist or an expert on Henri Corbin, but simply a poet. And poets aren't universally wonderful people, but any more than any of us are. But it seems to me that much of what Jung and Corbin and Hillman and I are talking about is simply assumed to be true by all sorts of practicing poets, and they just go out and they create things. And I would like to do that. But of course, Corbin won't let me alone, so one of the poets who I've been paying a lot of attention to lately, as a poet, but also as a scholar, is Charles Olson, who, of course, was very interested in Henri Corbin's work. And there's a part of me that just can't give up the idea that you could learn a great deal, not in an academic, scholarly sense, but you could get a lot of personal development out of carefully comparing these Corbin and Olson, who were two wildly different personalities, and I might work on that.
You know, I mentioned to you that I'd done a New School set of conversations with Brother David Steindl-Rast, this great Catholic mystic, extraordinary man in his 80s now, the successor to Thomas Merton in the view of many. And he has a lovely line about poetry. He says that there are some experiences that only poetry can carry the freight. No. That it cannot be put into, other. And the more and more I think about it, I was taking a walk with a friend of mine the other day, and I said to him, the more I think about it, that there are these spiritual approaches to life, there are these literary and artistic approaches to life, there are these scientific approaches to life. We could name others, they're sort of physical, this, that, and the other. But what is common to the deepest truth of all of them seems to me an encounter with awe, an encounter with the numinous, and that it doesn't really matter which of these trajectories you take. The question is, can you listen deeply enough to what Hillman calls the acorn that's developing within you? Can you listen deeply enough so that that path takes you to that encounter with awe? And it really doesn't matter which one it is.
It's just a question of paying attention.
It's just a question of paying attention.
Which is extraordinarily difficult.
Yeah. So let's open this up for a few questions. We've got 15 minutes left. If you can keep your questions concise, we can do more with them. Did I do a good job of getting to simplicity for you? Good. We pushed Tom hard with it, but that was the goal. So questions, comments? Yes, right back there. Say your name, please.
Araika?
Yeah?
It's not really a question, it's more a comment. Well, two comments.
My comment was to Jung and how
he's being portrayed here more as a scientist and a medical doctor. I suppose I just wanted to point out that he was profoundly religious. And,
Yeah.
In the language you're using, he would be called mystic.
Yeah.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, she just wanted to point out that I've mentioned that Jung was a scientist and that he therefore probably had some of these problems, but that he was in fact profoundly religious and something of a mystic himself, which I wouldn't dispute for a minute.
Yeah, I mean, in particular, you said that you call him an agnostic when it came to...
Well, he does see, he's so complicated, he does that. I mean, you can certainly find places throughout his writings where he says, where he is asked. You can also find the opposite. But it seems to me, and I think Sham Dasani would agree with this, because I'm pretty sure it's what he's written in his book. I mean, he could never quite get rid of that desire to be accepted by the scientific community.
I agree, but I think that was basically because he wanted other people to get to the point of
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but he really, I mean, there was a very famous interview towards the end of his life.
Oh, sure.
And he was asked, do you believe in God?
Yeah.
And he said,
He says, no, I don't believe, I know.
I know.
Yeah.
I know
Yeah.
that exists. So in that respect, I just felt there was too much of a separation between him and Corbin, and they're not that were very close.
Yeah.
And, Corbin wrote a wonderful essay on Jung's book, Answer to Jung,
Yeah.
which is, a religious book.
Yeah.
And this was a religious essay. And it was clear that Corbin has the highest regard.
Oh, yeah.
They were very close. There's also a letter of appreciation written by him to Corbin, which is published in French, and things were translated, in the Friends of Henry Corbin
Yeah.
website.
Yeah.
And there you can really see the deep understanding between these two men.
No,
Extremely close mystically.
Yeah.
I just love the level of sophistication of this group of people. It's really astonishing. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Other comments?
I felt that had to be
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Sure.
Please, say your name, please.
Jung Kroll.
Yeah.
I have been struck by the writers of the imagination and the importance they are putting on images. But I've been perplexed to see that that words play so much of a role and actual images hardly. For Jung, there's the mandalas and paintings which he did. And I think for Corbin, there's less importance of actual images, at least in his books. And for Hillman, none. I have not encountered any photo painting in any of Hillman's work. Maybe maybe it is our tradition to be more comfortable with words. So when we talk so much about imagination and images, why are actual images have such a relatively little importance in this tradition?
Interesting.
Well, it occurs to me to say of Hillman that, I mean, he's a very wordy guy, for sure. I mean, he wrote a lot, quite eloquently, I thought. But he's often, I mean, for many years, he was a practicing therapist, and people brought him dreams all the time. And a lot of his work with the dreams would be linguistic work, but it would also be work on the image, on feeling the image and imagining the images and remembering the images and developing the images. I mean, images of snakes and images of mud and images of clouds and so I'm not. And then late in life, he married Margot McLean, who was a visual artist. I mean, they did the book together, the Dream Animals, and her paintings are fantastic. And he wrote little essays to go with each of them. So he did do that, and maybe he just assumed that maybe the wordiness of his writing is a compensation for all the clinical hours he spent working with images with, But I'm a wordy guy too, so it shouldn't. And my images are always most easily brought out by words. The images are there, but I work with them with words, so that would be the reason that anything I would say about images would be very wordy.
We got 3 comments,
That's
1,
really
2,
good.
3, and what we'll do is we'll take the comments and then ask Tom to respond to them together, please.
Just to follow up on that, I think that in defense of Hillman, the city was an image, money was an image.
Yeah.
Although that's Sardello, but still,
Yeah.
all of the life was an image, and I want to move back to the importance of thinking in metaphor. And metaphor are words, but they're images, and in order to become metaphor, they have to be embodied. So
Yeah.
It just seems to me that he really focused on enlivening what, seeing them as images, but enlivening what was dead.
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting point to contemplate that you raised, because, I mean, we could be having lectures about, I don't know, Cy Twombly, or pick your favorite, visual artist or dancer, or, and it's perfectly plausible to imagine. We don't do it, but it's perfectly plausible to imagine, as George Steiner says somewhere in one of his books, a world in which there are no critics and there are no commentators. There's just poetry and art and music, and the best commentary on a piece of art sculpture would be another sculpture, and the best commentary on a piece of music would be another piece of music, and the best commentary of a poem would be another poem, or an epic would be another epic, or a dance would be another dance, and just get rid of critics and commentators. So there would be the wordy people, and there would be the painting people, and there would be the sculpture people, and we don't, in fact, do that. It's a very wordy culture. I mean, we're very logocentric, according to some philosophers. I certainly am. But the point that you are both sort of talking about is there are other ways to respond to images besides in words. And that's really important to recognize, because some people work much better in clay or dance or music than in words, and that's their form of active imagination. Or architecture, I'm thinking that too. Best response to a building is another building.
I'm going to try to get as many people as we can. You're next.
Hi, so just to comment on what we're speaking to, I started the morning before we came in speaking with my philosophy professor, and he brought up Dennett's work on in Consciousness Explained, and how he spoke to word being the first form of consciousness. And my sense is that, being a visual artist, that there's a karmic predisposition to whether one is an image person or a language textual person. For me, myself, image comes first, language comes second, and my sense is that it's a personal thing. I just need to.
Let's hold comments for a minute and gather some more. Yes.
I just want to real quick on the Hillman as well. I don't want to go too far.
Right.
But what we were talking about with metaphors and so forth, I think what personally working with Hillman is he doesn't give the picture, because it would almost make it stagnant. This is what he sees. And what he's doing, he considers it what he says egola. It's the spirits that rise from the underworld, from the Odyssey and so forth. And he's evoking imagery. So by him giving an image, and as a wordy person, I think would be too easy. He's making you actually, use the metaphor and cross that bridge or cross that river.
Thank you for that comment. And let's just get, yes, there?
You mentioned the religion and the idea of the risks and the dangers it has when it's being publicly expounded upon, I guess, and expressed in a public way, regardless of being institutionalized. Do you feel that there are any risks or dangers with putting in spirituality and exploring consciousness into the institutionalized program of psychology in terms of the hierarchical levels of its relation to government and mass communications and what have you? Do you feel like there are risks in bringing this type of personal pilgrimage into the institutionalized subject in academia or psychology?
Well, it's hard to do without getting in trouble. I mean, it's hard for me to respond to that. There can be a conflict because I don't know, again, you always puzzle me. I'm not sure I'm answering your question. I feel like I'm not. But the idea would be that any institutional structure tends to squash and devalue the private, what then becomes private, personal experience of the units that are under the aegis of the institution. And it happens, I mean, it happens in academia, it happens in politics, it happens in churches, it happens across the board. It's what Corbin was so adamant about. On the other hand, you can't let it happen. So you have to keep pushing up from below and saying, and that was what Corbin saw his life's work to be about. He's saying, no, don't let the institutions have hegemony, you know? I mean, you've got to. Is that answering your question at all?
I guess it's something I get concerned about here and there. Is there as people are becoming more comfortable with their spirituality and writing articles and writing books and making a lot of this information so public and open to interpretation. Getting it almost, a lot of these things are, especially with college students or the college environment, having this information funnel into, for example, psychology's historical role in advertising and manipulation of consciousness. So something as precious as religion and personal, real spirituality, getting that into that same category of commodity.
I'm still not quite on your wavelength, but one thing that worries me, I have a colleague who teaches a course called Bread, Love, and Dreams, and the students flock to it. It's a little school, but they flock to it. And what they've done for years is analyze each other's dreams. And this always makes me very nervous. I mean, Freud worried about wild analysis. And I've argued to students that, well, be careful which dreams you share. I mean, this is one tiny part of what you're talking about, maybe. Be careful which dreams you share, because some of them are damn supposed to be private. I mean, I've had some really big dreams. Hillman would say there are no big dreams. But I've had some bloody big dreams. And for a long time, it was quite clear to me that, no, those are not for sharing. You do not make these things public. And then, 15, 20 years later, I would be in a situation like this, and I could share this image with you now because it's but Corbin would be adamant about that, about that's in a sense what makes it sacred. It's not private in that it's mine, but it's in the temenos. There is a sacred precinct, and you'd have to choose your friends very carefully who gets in the temple with you, and then maybe nobody, and that the violation of that particular boundary, and this would lead to some very interesting discussion. There are some boundaries that should not be crossed, and it's very hard to know exactly what those are. But that would be one potential danger of the spreading of things which should be private into a public realm, which will then devalue them and demean them and make fun of them.
I'm a big believer on ending on time, particularly when a group of people has been so dedicated as to stay through this whole long day.
You folks are amazing.
I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank Simone State.
Thank you for coming.
I just want to honor the extraordinary 20 years of work that Tom Cheetham has done to give us this important vision of the work of Henri Corbin and to open up the great richness of the field of Islamic mysticism and its profound contribution to the unity of the prophetic tradition and to an honoring of all traditions of spirit and faith. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.